Hello friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. During the Clone Wars, the Jedi drastically changed from a monastic order with some light peacekeeping duties to full-on military commanders leading the Republic military on many fronts of the Clone Wars. This was a war, of course, started by the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, and one of the side effects of this conflict was it began to shape and change the Jedi into a much more flawed and chaotic organization. I've always argued that the Jedi's view on life, one that is removed from emotional connections, is extremely hard to maintain, especially when you're living in a regular society. It's an oversimplification to say that the Jedi's beliefs are derived completely from Eastern religions that focus on self-enlightenment and getting rid of one's human attachments, but there are some very big similarities with their core tenets. It's not surprising that in some Buddhist sects, in order to achieve this lofty goal of removing emotions as a driving force behind one's actions, that monks oftentimes seclude themselves from society. This means living in extremely remote places that are extremely difficult to reach, like on a mountaintop or live customer support. When individuals like the Jedi are thrown in the midst of a war without training, without mental preparation or counseling, it becomes increasingly hard to uphold their virtuous beliefs. The Jedi are taught to be compassionate for all life. How exactly does that work in war, where a Jedi is in constant mortal peril and needs to take lives in order to save them? If you think about it, the Jedi are extremely lucky that the majority of the enemies they fight are droids. Imagine just how messed up the Jedi would be if they were doing this to human beings instead. This is my issue with extreme ideologies and rules. I mean, if you really can't enforce rules and regulations, just don't create them in the first place. Build better people, not better rules. You control freaks. And so as the war dragged on, the Jedi proved to be unprepared for the consequences of all this violence, and their perfect godlike image began to shatter as more and more individuals in their rank proved to be human after all. You see, all living beings are empty vessels somewhat when they're born. We can be tainted or bolstered by our experiences, but if you fill a cup with hate and destruction for several years in a row, even the purest of souls cannot remain unchanged. Unless they're alien, in which case the existence of a soul is questionable somewhat. Before we continue, a word from our sponsor for today's video, ownersaber.com. Now, a lot of you keep on accusing me of ransacking the Jedi Temple post-Order 66 and looting the bodies of fallen Jedi. I would never do such an unspeakable thing because it is completely unspeakable. I actually got this beautiful thing from ownersaber.com, and it was actually really simple. No getting abducted as a child by magical wizards, no forced pledges of celibacy, and of course, a special safety feature that prevents you from cutting off your own limbs in case you're terrible at using a lightsaber, like Din Djarin. Right now, ownersaber.com has three main categories of blades. First, you have the dueling blade. These blades are a lot lighter and more simple in build, which means they're better balanced, and they're really great for swinging around and hitting things with, because that's what they're designed for, sparring. Then there are the higher quality Profi board and Xenopixel lightsabers. These are going to be more expensive, more detailed, and also a lot heavier, especially in the blade, and that's because, as you can see, there are individual LEDs that run throughout the whole thing, so you can do all sorts of cool stuff, like that, and like that. From now until April 8th, every blade is 20% off. And plus, they'll give you a free display stand with your purchase. It won't show up in the checkout page, they'll just ship it directly with your blade. Also, use our promo code MEOW, that's all caps, for an additional 10% off. Thank you for your patience, back to the rest of the video. At first, there was the lower ranking individuals in the Jedi Order who started exhibiting symptoms of the dark side. This includes, of course, bloodlust, bloodthirst, drinking the blood of thy enemies, and of course, blood in one's stool. But eventually, this insanity even reached the highest ranks of the Jedi Order when the High Council decided to approve, yes, the assassination of Count Dooku. Granted, others have tried such things throughout the war, including Asajj Ventress, a former apprentice of Count Dooku. But this was different. It wasn't like some small, pro-Republic extreme militant group. It wasn't even some rogue intelligence officer or a rogue Jedi. This was the ruling council of the Jedi Order, leaders of an organization that supposedly is the moral compass of the entire Republic. Now, this part of Star Wars lore is lesser known because it takes place in the extremely underrated Dark Disciples novel, and not on the big screen or the little screen. The novel starts off with a chaotic scene. A bunch of Mahon refugee ships are escaping their home planet, and they get destroyed by Separatist forces. We don't actually have pictures of these aliens, but from their description, they look like this. So yeah, Count Dooku ordered the destruction of a ship which was basically full of adorable puppies. In the next scene, we find ourselves on Coruscant in the center tower of the Jedi Temple. Mace Windu, Kenobi, Yoda, Anakin, and many others are gathered there, and they're having a very serious discussion. The war has raged on for 3 years, and the destruction of the Mahran refugee convoy was a very egregious event and one in the latest of many terrible things carried out by the CIS. Many individuals were convinced that Count Dooku was an evil so great that they would need to go to extraordinary lengths to stop him. Mace Windu lambasted how one man's ambition and evil can cause so much destruction. Sound familiar? Kenobi, as usual, takes a more balanced approach and remarked that Dooku is not completely responsible for each terrible action. Others were also involved. Plo Koon responds that Obi-Wan Kenobi sounds awfully familiar to Count Dooku's own propaganda. Count Dooku has blamed this entire war on the Jedi. Yoda dismisses Dooku's accusations as nonsense, but Mace Windu surprisingly interjects and asks Yoda if he really thinks the Jedi are completely innocent in this matter. He goes on to explain that he believes the Jedi have not explored every option to end this war sooner. He goes on to talk about how Count Dooku is essential for the Separatist cause, and that if the head is cut off, the body will fall. Kenobi would immediately reject this idea and claims that this would lead to the dark side, and Yoda agrees as well. But soon, the side that supports assassination grows stronger as the list of war crimes by the Separatists are repeated in the council chambers. And it's hard to argue against such death and destruction. We're talking about the loss of millions, if not billions, of lives. And ultimately, even the wise Grand Master Jedi Yoda gives in to the pressure. Mace Windu's assassination attempt will commence, and they'll be using one of their own members, Master Quinlan Vos, to carry out the deed. Despite the fact that the Jedi Order are not voted into power in any way, they still do represent the Republic in many ways. Before the war, for instance, the Jedi were oftentimes used as diplomats by the Republic to settle disputes and create treaties. More importantly, the lack of checks and balances against the Jedi shows us just how much the Republic really trusted this organization. This trust was so great that the Jedi essentially had unlimited power and free to do whatever they wanted because the public viewed them as having the moral high ground. And so, as the moral compass and defenders of the Republic, what the Jedi do is extremely important. The Clone Wars was seen as a civil war by many, where the Separatists and Republic were having a battle in values and beliefs. I would argue that ordering the assassination of a foreign head of state, even one that is so evil as Count Dooku, would severely damage the image of the Republic as a free society that believes in rules. I mean, essentially, they would play right into the propaganda of the Separatists here, and more importantly, show us that the Republic is no different from the Separatists. Victory at all costs is a mentality that has been adopted by many individuals who, as we mentioned before, have had their vessels filled up with hatred and trauma. And many times when a conflict becomes too long-winded and brutal, those freedom fighters and defenders of liberty turn into the very monsters they were trying to destroy in the first place. I mean, war and suffering is a contagion that only creates more war and suffering. From a strategic standpoint, taking out Count Dooku might lead to the end of the war and an end to the CIS, but we have to look at every possibility as well. For instance, does the CIS have a clear line of secession, or will chaos befall this newly created confederacy, and more importantly, will all of its weapons and ships fall into the hands of competing warlords and bandits, which of course would further complicate the post-war peace process and might even lead to new skirmishes and clashes. This is assuming that the Republic, of course, does not occupy all of CIS territory at the end of the war, which of course would be extremely bloody and costly. On paper, the Confederacy of Independent Systems was supposed to have a relatively weak central government, one that is focused more on planetary rights and power, but in reality, Count Dooku's policies mirrored that of Palpatine. Once in office, he immediately began to degrade the institutions that protected the citizens' ability to practice self-determination. The Parliament of the Confederacy of Independent Systems held very little true power. If any of the senators created directives or legislation that he was opposed to, he would just kind of disappear them. Or in the case of Mina Bonteri, they would just get assassinated. Mina Bonteri's only wish was to resume peace talks between the Confederacy and the Republic. So who really had control over Dooku aside from Palpatine? Well, you had the Separatist High Council. This is sort of like the Russian State Duma. This is a pay-to-play style of government. The High Council is made up of organizations like the Trade Federation, Techno Union, Corporate Alliance, Intergalactic Banking Clan, and so on. They support the state with their financial or material contributions and in return are able to gain unlimited access to the CIS market without any regulation. Without them, Dooku and Sidious's CIS military would be non-existent. These corporate entities abuse the citizens of the Confederacy in every way imaginable. Debt trapping, hostile corporate takeovers, price fixing, and even slavery. And so when Count Dooku falls, If there isn't a complete fragmentation of the CIS, then another very similar autocrat will just take over, because that is what the oligarchs want. In this case, it's a literal cyborg whose heart is encased in a metal ribcage. General Grievous had even less experience in statecraft, and he was 100% militarily focused. Perhaps he's a weaker opponent than Count Dooku, but he still represents the same mentality of control through oligarchs and the oppression of the civilian populace, combined with a healthy side of war crimes against the Republic. Ultimately, when the CIS fell, the reason was because Darth Sidious ordered Anakin to literally murder every one of these oligarchs. But if the CIS were not secretly being controlled by Palpatine, I'm pretty sure they would have continued fighting, even with Count Dooku gone. Dooku might have even been seen as a martyr, because assassinations are not exactly kosher. So the Jedi and the Republic would have severely tainted their own moral high ground and gained very little as a result. It's a shame that more people don't know about this secret Jedi plot to assassinate Count Dooku. It really shows us how far the Jedi have fallen throughout this war. You would imagine this kind of covert operation being carried out by Republic intelligence or Palpatine himself, but no. This is a complete Jedi mission. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, and my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.